Just as a warning, this video might make you just a little bit angry because it's an example of where justice has failed. Now, it's not the justice system that's failed this person, and it's not the lawyer that failed this person. I can tell you that because I was the lawyer in the case. In fact, we won the case, but still it's an example of where justice fails. But make sure you watch all the way to the end of the video because I'm going to give you some tips on how to avoid this situation so that you don't end up in the frustrating situation where you have won the case and yet somehow justice has still been lost. So welcome back. I am the Black Belt Barrister, helping you to understand law and fighting for your rights. So this was a case of a client of mine. Obviously, I can't give you any details, but what I can tell you is the very basic outline of the case, what happened and why I feel justice has failed in this particular case, and how you might be able to avoid the failure of justice if you end up in the same position. So a client approached me early 2019 because he'd made a purchase for just less than £10,000 and we ended up making a claim against the trader. We ended up in court towards the end of 2020 and we got judgment against both the company and against the person who runs the company as an individual. This is an important part because ordinarily you can't get a judgment against an individual who's running a company if you've made a contract with the company. This is because there's what's known as a corporate veil or limited liability, in which the company is responsible for the contract and the individual directors and shareholders are limited unless, of course, they've committed some kind of fraud. So in that situation, we did get a judgment against both the company and the individual concerned. So we followed all of the procedures, obviously writing to the parties first and then filing the claim in court, following all the court orders and going to court, preparing the case, submitting the case. I went to court for the client and won. So we walked away with a judgment in full for the full amount. But here is where and why justice fell down. Now, again, I say it's not the justice system that is at fault here because it provided a judgment that was enforceable in any method possible. But here's the problem. As the House of Lords said many years ago, the most appropriate defendant is one that you can find, bring to court, and then enforce judgment against. Now, that's the problem, enforcing the judgment. Because if you cannot find this individual, then it's going to be difficult to enforce the judgment. Because if you can't find the individual and any bank accounts that are linked to that individual, or any assets that are linked to that individual, and any properties that are linked to that individual, then you are going to have a difficult time enforcing that judgment. The court system and the justice system does provide a method of enforcing these judgments, because if you know the bank account, or if you know a property, or if you can find assets, there are things known as a High Court writ or a warrant of control, which allow you to take control of goods and get them sold at auction with the help of bailiffs. If you know the bank account, you can get what's known as a third-party debt order, which is where the court orders the bank to pay you the money because you have a judgment in your favour against the defendant who has the bank account with the bank. But if you can't find any of these, you're going to struggle to be able to take into action any of these things. Even if you were to petition the person's bankruptcy, you will need to know an address for that person, or at the very least know where they are. Because if you want to have a petition of bankruptcy, you need to find the person and personally serve a notice of a bankruptcy hearing, which is obviously heard in court in the person's presence, and they need to be served personally. As for the company defendant, well, equally, they've taken steps to avoid responsibility under the judgment as well. Simply put, it appears that they just stopped trading or had someone else start trading in their place in a different name, which ostensibly, on the surface, looks entirely like it's somebody else and not that particular company. So unless you can prove that any of the assets at that premises belong to that company that you have the judgment against, then again you're going to struggle to enforce control of those goods because you can't prove that they belong to the company. So as promised, how do you avoid such a situation? Well, in the event that you are buying something from a company and you want to look much further ahead. If something goes wrong and you have to sue and you end up in court and then you get a judgment and then you want to enforce that judgment, you need to make sure right at the outset that you can track down the individuals that are listed as directors and shareholders of the company. You need to be able to ensure that the company is one of a solid standing and is not going to disappear overnight, and their assets are not going to disappear overnight. This is usually easier if you look on Companies House. You can see how old the company is, where the company is registered. And if you find one of these companies that is only registered to one of these post box addresses in London, or the directors are only listed at these post box addresses in London, and you're going to struggle to find any of the directors and shareholders or any of the assets of the company, then you can look forward and reliably predict that you're going to struggle to enforce any future judgment for a purchase that you haven't yet made, if that became necessary. Because if you go through this process and spend what is ultimately going to be several £1,000s with a lawyer to go to court and get a judgment, which you then cannot enforce, then you can wind this all the way back and think to yourself, do I really want to make this purchase in the first place? Now, it might be an odd place to start your negotiating when you're buying something, to start rooting around as to where the company is registered and whether the director is registered at one of these nominated addresses somewhere. Now, good companies will very often have the registered office as their accountant, and their accountant certainly is going to be somewhat distinct from the company and in a place that you can go and find. But I tell you this story to offer a little bit of guidance and I suppose a little bit of warning that if you are making a large purchase, which a court claim is hopefully not the first thing on your mind, it should certainly form part of your decision process, because if you are going into a large purchase and you are spending a lot of money, which ultimately, if everything goes wrong and you need to get it back, then you're going to struggle if all of those things are going to obscure the location and the assets of the company and its directors and its shareholders. So I hope you found this story interesting. Please give it a thumbs up and share it with somebody that you feel might really benefit from this story and videos like these. And as always, thank you for watching.